Right. Hi, everyone. We're live. You should have Sam right now, so sorry for the poor standing that you get here. Very happy to introduce our slasherist and serial killer panel. Do you want to start us off with an introduction to yourself and your books? And we're going to start with Sean because
Hi guys, I'm Sean Campbell. I write the D.I. Morton serial crime series. There you go. I've already said something embarrassing. I can't speak this evening. So you probably heard of me for that. I also do the D.I. Rafferty series as well as standalones, including the Grifter. And yeah, that's it.
So hi, I'm NV Peacock, otherwise known as Nikki. I write thrillers. I've got 3 currently. I've got The Brother, which I'm hoping we're talking about today. We've got 13th Girl. Those are both with Hira and Canelo. And I've also got Little Bones that features a serial killer, and that's with HarperCollins. And I also co-host a podcast called The Red Rabbit Hole with Lisa Shepherd, the comedian and therapist. And we interview authors, thriller and horror authors, about the true crimes that inspired their books.
brilliant.
Hello, I'm EJ Wood. I write thrillers, crime, police procedurals, and more recently a couple of memoirs about my life in Spain. These are just a couple of books that I've brought out recently.
So the first question that I thought I'd ask you is how much of the frame of reference do you think for this kind of genre comes from slasher movies?
Well, the concept of the final girl from slasher movies, I think, kind of features in a lot of books. I know it definitely, with 13th Girl, it was part of my journey, I guess, onto the story. And I kind of like if people don't know what the final girl is, it's always the one girl that is alive at the end. She's kind of the arch nemesis of the slasher, and she survives to the end. It could be a little bit kind of anti-feminist, but she survives to the end because she's a good girl. She doesn't do anything that she shouldn't do, and she's virtuous, and she defeats him at the end. And I like that kind of concept, so I can definitely see that in my own work.
Interesting. I think it's a bit of a cliche almost to have that sort of girl who survives to the end. And a lot of crime fiction goes so much deeper because you don't need to rely on those tropes of there's a pretty girl who's managed to avoid death for 90 minutes, and then right at the end you've got this harrowing moment where she almost dies, and then you're back to catching the bad guy. A lot of crime fiction, you've got serial killers who are potentially much deeper, often driven by mental health issues that you never get in slasher films. And I think you can get a lot more nuance in a book than the film generally. And in particular, I think when you're looking at serial killers versus slashers, serial killers for me are about the psychology of it. It's about the forensics. It's about the people behind it and why they kill and who they kill, and most of all the victims. And the last bit is where you really fall down in horror, is that the victims are reduced to that very simplistic person running away rather than somebody who has got a complex life story behind them, who brings their story to the fore and whose story impacts the story itself. I don't want victims to be a cut-out. I think they have to be at the forefront of any crime story. Otherwise, it runs a risk of being a bit almost unfair, diminishing of the victim's role, because the victim is arguably the most important person.
And I think you were right in sort of saying about the difference between slashers and serial killers, because in terms of sort of real world, we do get a lot of serial killers in the real world, but fortunately we don't get as many slashers in terms of like the kind of Freddy Krueger's, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers that you see in films and that. So I think it's kind of the exaggerated serial killer and condensed serial killer for the whole kind of, like you were saying, like the 90 minutes that you need them for.
Isn't it difficult writing a slasher, because every time someone reads a book they want to know why the person is killing? So why would you just write about someone that just aimlessly goes around killing people, unless it's, pure and out horror? People want to know the whys, don't they? The trauma that makes someone do what they do.
But even in slashers, they do have backstories. I mean, Jason Voorhees was, he watched his mum die and he was almost drowned in the Camp Crystal Lake. And Freddy Krueger was burnt alive by parents of children that thought he was doing something he shouldn't. And so they do have backstories, but they do tend to be more basic, I guess, because they're not as developed as characters. Because like you said, all they're doing is actually just going around killing people.
It's often very visual, isn't it? You've got the burn victim. Sorry.
Carry on.
I'm just thinking that the sort of visual depiction of the serial killer is that they not only act evil, but they look evil. They've got the deformed face, they've got the disfigurations, they've got burnt skin, and we can immediately see at a glance who the bad guy is. Whereas in fiction, if you see 3 or 4 characters in the room, you don't necessarily immediately know who the serial killer might be about to be.
But that's more like real life. I mean, serial killers, they don't look like serial killers. They look like you and I.
Do they?
I've been told.
Which one of them is
Yeah,
it?
I think in terms of like slasher films, you've got to remember the kind of heyday of when they started was sort of in the 70s and the 80s, and the amount that we knew about that kind of person was very different then to what we, we're very fascinated. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm absolutely gripped by any kind of serial killer information or documentaries or things that I see, especially if there's a new serial killer that kind of pops up in the news. I'm there with bated breath looking to see what's going on. Whereas in the kind of 70s and 80s, yes, there were serial killers knocking around, but they didn't have the kind of in-depth research that we do on them nowadays. Because the media wasn't there to be able to do it. There was no internet, there was no podcasts, there was no, even the FBI with the behavioral unit was very kind of young in its age. So I think from when the slasher genre started, they were quite basic in terms of, they killed people. They still had, when you look at slasher films, even the very young ones, they still had quite an interesting message. And I think people kind of forget to look deep into them because of the gore and the kind of the shock value that can come into them.
Yeah. It's interesting what you said about it being sort of almost an immature market early on, that whereas these days we've got things like Des on TV that's dramatization of a real story, and it feels so lifelike seeing David Tennant in one of his creepiest portrayals ever as Des. He was chilling in it, and that actually happened in Cranley Gardens, which is like half a mile from where I'm sitting. And it's to see the streets that I know quite well, to imagine someone who's just got this very boring suburban house, and then the murders that went on in the basement because of discrimination, because of sort of the backstory there of him being the closeted gay guy in North London, and how much sort of nuance and depth comes to the modern television, which of course you can't get through in 90 minutes. You've got to start with a really simple concept. You deliver a very, very punchy slasher opening, and then you've got to run with it, and the violence is what drives it from then on. But you need that initial hook to be relatively simple.
The initial
Well,
hook.
I was speaking to someone recently that said, which would be quite a good idea for a book, really. They had usually go traveling, and they have a dog sitter, and they rang up last year whether it would be okay to book their dog in a day earlier, and their son answered the phone, and they said, "Oh my God, is so and so okay?" And he just said no, and straight away the person I was talking to was saying, "Oh, oh my God, something happened. They've been involved in a car accident." They were speechless, couldn't say anything. And it ended up that this dog sitter was all over the news. And what had happened was she'd walked into a bar. I won't say the area, but she walked into this bar in quite a rough area of England. And the landlord was her ex-brother-in-law. And she got into a fight, took him outside, and basically stabbed him to death. And then she's jumping for joy, going, I killed him. And the person I was talking to was thinking, but they were just such a normal person. They loved my dog. They had lovely children. And yet something from like 20 years ago just triggered her, because I'm fascinated by female serial killers because it's not really the norm. But something triggered her, and she just said, I've got to kill him. And then she just got a knife and stabbed him to death. And it was all over CCTV.
So is that a slow burn sort of murder where she had previous trauma that came to the fore?
Well,
or quite spontaneous?
I wonder if this bloke had actually perhaps raped her maybe 20 years ago, because she was shouting that he's a rapist, he's going to die, or that he had actually threatened her daughter. Because I said, well, it's not normal that 20 years on, you just walk into a bar and then have an argument, go off to your car, grab a knife, and then gut him basically in the street.
Not normal to have a knife in your car.
To say, why did she have a knife in the car? That seems a bit premeditated.
I don't know, but she's banged up in prison for life now. And she's only in her 50s, and she's now banged up in prison for the rest of her life. And I thought, what triggered her to suddenly just want to stab someone several times? And I thought that was quite strange, really.
Yeah.
I'm going to carry on my theme of movies before we move on, and ask how you ramp up the tension in your books, because it's very easy in a kind of movie about a serial killer or a slasher to ramp up the tension just by showing the person, isn't it? If you think about Halloween and things like that, you just need a little shot of Michael Myers, don't you? And it makes everyone scared. How do you manage to build up that tension in your fiction? Because you can't do it as easily as a movie can.
Well, I tend to have small things happen first. So you kind of ramp up tension by having something that happens that could be easily explained away as something else. And then you have something happen that's a little bit worse, but that could still be kind of explained. You know, you can get away with that. But then something happens that you think, hang on a minute, what's going on? And then eventually it gets to the point where it crescendos into something that cannot be explained in terms of the outside coming in towards your protagonist.
Who wants to go next?
I've got it. So for me, I like to play with time and tension. So there's that idea that if you've got a bomb and it goes off, that's dramatic and it gives you one impactful moment. Whereas if you know there's a bomb under the table and it's about to go off and the timer says 5 minutes and you watch it ticking down, every second you get closer to the explosion is more and more impactful because you're slowly ratcheting up the tension so that things get bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can sort of play with that both in the literal sense and in sort of an emotional sense to build the conflict between character and killer as attempts are made, as mistakes are made, and as that sort of figurative or literal bomb gets closer and closer to going off. And for me, that's one of the most interesting ways to build the tension at the end. And sometimes you want to subvert that and do something that's a little bit different. And sometimes you want to see a change in tactic or a change in victim profile, because a lot of the serial killers that are the most interesting ones in fiction, it's often a very clever serial killer. It tends to be someone who's playing cat and mouse with the police. And so you sometimes see that sort of fake out moment where the police have been building to one conclusion and then the serial killer suddenly changes tack and hairs off in a way that looks unpredictable in the moment. But if you look back and read the past 300 pages, you see it's sort of an inevitable ending to the book. So as well as ratcheting up tension, you can sort of play with form quite a bit there.
I'm not sure how to answer that question really, because well, the beginning of my books, I like to start with a scene that takes place much later in the book. So straight away, the reader hopefully thinks, okay, what's going to happen? How did we get to that point? So I would start off with a dramatic entrance. Maybe there'd be lots of blood and gore, or like Sean may explain, there'd be an explosion. And then throughout the beginning chapters, we lead our way to how that happened, and then for the rest of the book, why it happened. But I'm not really sure how I build up tension. Maybe I don't. I don't know. Maybe that's for someone else to answer. I think they're dramatic, but I don't know.
I think the dramatic opening is a good way of building tension.
I've been working on it over the every book that I do. I think, right, how can I make this beginning a bit more, impact? And I normally write about 3 or 4 different beginnings before I'm happy with that beginning. So the original beginning might end up being chapter 3. So I end up working my way backwards in a way to try and build the tension that way, if that makes sense.
It does. We've got some hellos from people. So Donna and Sarah are watching. Donna says we need to keep her distracted in her last hour of work because people are annoying her.
Just kill them.
I think that's maybe the message she's getting from this panel. Michelle Kidd said hello. And Mary Veazey said that she likes your books. They're set where she lives, Nikki.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Mary.
You met earlier in the year at her local library.
Mm-hmm. We did indeed.
There you go. So you remembered. Right. So you all got some. We talked about serial killers earlier. Now I know there are serial killers in real life, but there aren't as many as there are in fiction.
Thank God.
Huh?
Or that we know about.
What do we think are the differences between kind of real and imaginary ones? I'm kind of really interested to hear your version of this, Emma, because you go for women ones. Oh, lost her.
She's gone.
Get her away. Hopefully she'll come back in.
Can't have her secrets.
Yeah, she's not going to tell us.
Someone got her.
So again, the differences between kind of real and imaginary ones. I was thinking about this earlier and thinking that the elaborate signatures that you get in like fiction are kind of a
They
little
just don't
bit.
exist, do they, in real.
You just because you'd get caught so easily, wouldn't you? If you're like, hang on, will I pose my victim really artfully on the side of the road?
It would be a bit distinctive. Oh, we've gone back.
I don't know. I think you'd be surprised at some of the stuff that's kind of happened out there. And we don't, unfortunately, well, as the UK or maybe even the US and looking further afield, we don't have a great track record of actually finding them. Unless a serial killer's killed someone that they know and there's a link to, which doesn't always happen, then it can be really hard to track someone down. If they're killing strangers, unless there's a witness or someone who knows someone, you're kind of scuppered a little bit. So you can take some DNA, but until you catch someone, that DNA is useless to be able to match to anything.
Sometimes they fall into that geographic profiling trap where their first kill starts relatively close to home and then they work their way further and further out. There've been some interesting cases where they've used that to look, and you can see as serial killers, we plot them over time on a map and how they'll start relatively near to home as a sort of mature criminal and then work their way out. And that sometimes can get you closer to the killer than fingerprints or DNA, which of course rely on them having already been arrested or otherwise have been entered into the system.
Yeah. I mean, one of my books, The Brother, talks about like forensic genealogy and being able to match the DNA. And the states are doing such great work with it. I mean, it's not available in every state by any stretch, but having access to effectively commercial DNA databases so you can match relatives of killers and work them back. And that's the basis of The Brother. But in terms of the UK, for some reason, we just don't want to do it. And I don't understand why. I mean, we do have a DNA database, but it tends to be for people that have been arrested already and have stayed in the system, which is a fraction of the whole of the UK. So trying to find anyone who's done, not just people that have that have committed crimes, but also victims that still don't have their names, victims that are John and Jane Doe's. America has been able to track quite famous cases. There was one very famous case, Tent Girl, and also the Orange Socks murder, where this poor girl was found naked other than a pair of orange socks. I'm wearing the orange as well. And she didn't have a name. She was literally just known as Orange Socks for decades until this method came along and they actually found out who she was.
I think the only downsides of this, I think the reason the UK don't do it is like the strict ethics of like sharing people's DNA things without their permission.
They
and
do.
Also, you do have to be cautious of what the commercial DNA companies are doing, because some of them were returning like actual human kind of origins for like dog DNA and things that was being sent in, so they're not always the most accurate.
No, I think they'd have to be tested and make sure and kept under strict guidelines. But if somebody's willing to tick a box, I would be more than willing to tick a box if I was giving my DNA to say, if my DNA can help solve a crime or give a name to an unknown victim, by all means use it. And then it's up to the people, then it's actually giving them the chance to do it if they want to. And if they don't, then they can tick a box that says, no, don't use my DNA.
I remember
sorry.
No, go on. Carry on.
There was funny you should say that about the girl in the orange socks. There was a case that I came across a couple of years ago called The Boy in the Box, which was about a boy that was found at about 4 years of age. He was found in a cardboard box in the middle of Pennsylvania, somewhere in the States. And he was just known for 60 years as the boy in the box because no one had a DNA profile for him, which was what inspired me to write The Boy in the Box. And the strange thing is that when I was coming to the end of writing this book, they actually found through a cousin that had uploaded their DNA to this genealogy site, they'd managed to find out who the boy was, and he was identified as Joseph Augustus Zarelli. And I thought that was really strange how I'd basically used him for inspiration for one of my own books and named by the same title, and then come to the end of it, he was identified, which is lovely.
And you've got to think as well, I mean, it's extended families, for all they know that the girl in the orange socks had ran away and just not wanted to speak to her family and friends ever again. Nobody knew what happened to her. So to actually find out, no, she did meet okay, a horrible end, but she didn't want to leave you. You know, she was taken from you. It's still a little bit of peace. And also to give like a child their name back like that. I mean, you don't want a grave that says the boy in the box.
No.
So I think it's worth it. I would be more than willing to give my DNA up to be able to try and help them at least a little bit.
I suppose over time, as those databases grow, they'll become more and more useful for that anyway. You don't need everyone's DNA, you just need a critical mass. And I thought it would be interesting if your cousin came and said, "Don't give your DNA."
You'd be like, "Whoa, what you done?"
Actually.
Do you I mean, I think DNA is like an interesting thing in the terms of these books anyway, isn't it? Because people in forensics think it's often like the smoking gun, and it isn't always as like accurate or as wonderful a piece of evidence as we all think it is. Because it's like any biological molecule, it doesn't do particularly well left out on its own, exposed to nature.
Yeah, I think we're all from the CSI generation, aren't we? That we're kind of fed, like kind of spoon fed how forensics works, and kind of DNA and all the kind of information. And as an author with doing research for the books, I have found a lot of that has been wrong.
I think, sorry, go on.
It's just I find that particularly interesting because a lot of my books I've actually dated in the late 1960s, and of course DNA and profiling and all that sort of thing weren't really as well known or researched as they are today. So I found it particularly challenging when I was trying to write how my police officers were going to catch a killer without the use of mobile phones, computers, DNA, and all the things that modern technology and resources help solve crimes. And so I can't say I want to go back there, mind you.
No. I mean, I just wrote one that's set in 91, and even then there was such little available. And I mean, my protagonist isn't in the police. I don't tend to write police procedurals. I tend to write psychological thrillers. So I want the police out of the book as quick as possible, so my character can then kind of do her work. And basically, all she's got is the British Library and a fax machine.
It's freeing not having to deal with DNA. DNA is in some ways quite complicated for the crime writer to sidestep, because if it is an open and shut DNA case where you've got a fresh sample where it has been collected, or in a house where you've got lots and lots of DNA, you want to explain why that isn't being used. And going back to a historical setting or having a non-police protagonist is a good way of not having to engage with that and not getting boxed into a corner by all the sort of modern forensic techniques that are out. And while they're not completely authentic all the time, they're not accurate 100% of the time, the perception among readers and the general public is that CSI is absolutely right, science is king. And you can't be trying to educate readers every single book that there are flaws in this system, and here's why, and here's the research, and here's the journal that says this might happen or that might happen, or if it was in the water for 6 days, the body would have this, and then after 8 that, because it gets very technical and very boring quite quickly for most people.
Yeah. And also you could find that you've got a reader that's ex CSI or ex police force, and they're reading your books and they're thinking, well, that's not quite accurate. And then it ruins the experience for the reader, because you yourself are not a CSI, you're not ex police, you're just basing your facts off what you can research. And like Nikki, it's one reason why I've tried to stay away from the police procedurals, because I'm not a police officer, I'm not a CSI, and you can very easily make mistakes when you're trying to introduce those details and you haven't got someone on your right arm that's giving you the literal facts of that particular decade, because they can change from decade to decade as well.
Yeah. This is a good argument for you. If you are going to do procedurals, you need to have experts you can consult. You need to have, someone who knows about poison. You need to have a CSI. You need a police procedural advisor. And that can add complications. It can hem the story in. It adds massive costs to the production time and the actual cost of putting it together. So if you can get away with not needing that and keep it on the characters and the story, in many ways it makes it more engaging.
And one of this particular book, Amelie, that sets place over a period of about 30 years. And I actually did consult with a friend of mine who was ex-police up in Staffordshire. So I based my character on him and I used his expertise. But even then, someone's still going to say, well, that didn't happen at that particular time, because I'm only relying on his memories and his experiences. But, you know, different areas, different counties, they might vary slightly. So it's something that I've tried to move away from in my later books. That's why I wrote 2 memoirs about living in Spain. I mean, it's write what you know, they say. So that's what I did.
I think as well, like you were saying with the CSI generation, is you've got a lot of people who do know what the procedures are and do know a bit about science, and it's kind of important to get it right if you're going down that route. Like, I know as a scientist, I find it really annoying if I read something about DNA and they get it wrong in a book. Do you know what I mean? That would instantly kind of throw my enjoyment of it, because that's like the field of science I know the most about. But there's a quite informed group of readers, isn't there, around things like that? And when you're venturing into sort of these killer kind of investigations, you do have to be careful that you get everything right.
I was actually having a very similar discussion. I run a writers group, and we have a couple of ex-police officers that are writing police procedural books that are in there. And I was sort of explaining to them, it's a fine line between getting something right and actually still making it entertaining as well, because real life, actually being in the police, is nowhere near as interesting as TV and books would have you believe. And it's making sure that although you are correct in what you're saying, that it also still fits that kind of exciting storyline that you need to be able to kind of catch the reader.
While we're on the sort of topic of the books that you're writing as well, I feel like the sort of theme of this panel is interesting in a way, but also must be really hard to do in good taste. If you're writing about things like serial killers or why people are doing this and going sort of really into that kind of crimes, how do you manage to sort of toe the line of keeping it?
I think it's very difficult. Sometimes you're going to stray into something that could be considered offensive. Anytime you're dealing with death, whoever has death, it's going to be potentially triggering for some readers. It's going to have echoes of historical cases like the boy in the box. And obviously, you want to be doing justice to the victims. You want to be doing justice to the police officers involved, potentially. And anytime you take that and fictionalize it, you're going to sensationalize it, because to create those big dramatic moments, you need to be going bigger, darker, often more violent, or potentially more victims, to create a series where there was a single victim, or to create a mass murder event, something that is potentially very, very dark. And sometimes you can deal with that by having equally light moments in the book. Sometimes you have to have gallows humor. A lot of policemen and policewomen will sort of deal with that sort of very dark material by making jokes that some of us wouldn't find funny, but if you're face to face with it all the time, it's one coping strategy for dealing with that. And I think having that authenticity behind the characters involved, whoever they may be, if you've got a police procedural and you're turning it from a police perspective, you want to have a protagonist who fits in with that sort of approach to life, that they are dealing with life and death all the time. Whereas perhaps if you've got a non-police protagonist doing an investigation, you don't need to be quite as dark, and you can engage in a different way.
And I think taste levels vary as well. I mean, taste is subjective. What kind of grosses me out might not gross you guys out, or vice versa. And, you know, for me, I just kind of write it to the level that I'd want to see.
Yeah.
Because I think if someone doesn't, you know, that if they're not willing to kind of go to that level, they're not going to pick that book up, because we've got summaries on the backs of the books. If they think that it's too sensationalized or it's not up their street, they're probably not a thriller reader and they can go off and get their romance book.
I've never been one to write romance, but I have started enjoying a dark romance, which is a duet between 2 characters, a male and a female, preferably in my case, where there is a thriller but told from the perspective of both the man and the woman. And I think that can build a lot of tension, but it also involves the thriller aspect of writing, which I enjoy. I missed that when I was writing the memoirs, because I like writing about serial killers and what makes them tick. So after I did 2, I went back to writing thrillers and the dark romance. And I find, like you said, with what bothers you, I don't have any what they call triggers now. I think that's a new thing where you need to have a trigger page and you need to pre-warn readers about what the content is. I mean, to me, if you're picking up a thriller, you have to kind of expect a certain amount of darkness. But I think readers nowadays, they're expecting more. They want it darker, they want it grittier, they want it more severe. I mean, I don't like writing about animal abuse, or maybe there's some child abuse that sort of plays a part in some of my books, but I find that readers now, they're wanting more and more and more, and it's finding that fine line of how far you can go without upsetting people, but also keeping the interest, because there's so many different books out there that cover so many different topics.
That's an interesting point. Apart from your own books about these topics, whose would you recommend?
Well, Mike Craven is always the go-to for serial killers. Everyone on UK Crime Book Club, I think, has read most of his Washington Post series at this point. But you can see how artful they are, that they've got a great puzzle. You've got incredible characters. And they do deal with the serial killer aspect without delving into being too gritty. They're not at the Chris Carter end of the spectrum, but equally they're certainly not your Agatha Christie cozy at the end.
No.
True. Anyone else got a recommendation? Or
I think there's too many to recommend. I mean, I love the C.K. Skuse, the Sweet Pea series, and
The humour.
and Jane Isaac's done some really good work with her police procedures, and I just, they're all good, but sometimes for all different reasons.
While we're on the topic of Jane Isaac, what's the craziest thing you've ever done as in the name of research?
Is this her shoulder of pork story?
Oh yeah, we've all heard a shoulder of pork story, but what have you guys done in the name of research or acting out a scene or anything like that? Have you got any good fun stories on the line of Jane?
Quite a lot.
I wouldn't call it research, but I have an older brother that tends to torture me quite a lot, and he once dressed up in the ghost face outfit from Scream and tried to chase me around the house when I got in from work one day. And I did go up the stairs. When you yell at those women, the kind of bimbos, oh, don't go, why did you go up the stairs? I went up the stairs, and I can tell you now, it's because my bedroom was up there, and my bedroom is a safe place. And that was all I was thinking, get to a safe place, get to a safe place.
So you slightly freaked out by Scream mask behind.
Oh, it wasn't that. It was just the fact he was just standing there when I came in, and I didn't know it was him in there, and he had like a retractable knife and stuff, and I just kind of went, did a Wallace.
Anyone else got a fun story in the name of research? Or?
Oh, I did a story about cults a few years ago.
You didn't join a cult, Sean, did you?
I didn't join one, not officially. I didn't feel like I could fill out the membership form and give them my DNA and blood and sign it in ink. But I did visit a few modern cults, including one that is particularly litigious, so I won't say who they are. But if you happen to walk down Tottenham Court Road, you can probably guess exactly what I'm talking about. And interacting with some of those people and watching the sort of techniques that they immediately employ, the love bombing, where they'll give huge amounts of compliments and invite you to things, the way they create their own standards and language in order to try and convince you that you're part of the in-group or out-group. You've got this sort of othering effect where they want you to be in the in-group so that you join them, you only trust them. So that's just one element of research I did for that. And other times I've done stuff like testing the physics of if you load up a van with a couple of crash test dummies and a couple of massive bags of sand, how much does the crash test dummy go when you push the van from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, just to see what the injuries would be like on the crash test dummy, so that I can replicate that on the body and the victim in the story. That was for Cleaver Square. So lots and lots of research there that tends to be a bit interesting. And yeah.
I wouldn't say it's research, but one Halloween I went out in a Tyvek suit and a dead hand once. And here in Spain, Halloween is a fairly new event. I mean, there's some Spanish find a reason to celebrate just because there's a day. So when they realise that the 31st of October is like some Halloween that everybody celebrates, the Spanish just slowly start to think, we can have a party here. So a few years ago, I went out in this Tyvek suit with this dead hand in a plastic bag. And when I walked into a cafe for a drink one evening, everyone just sort of went completely silent. And they, I said, what's the matter? I said, aren't you celebrating? I said, it's Halloween. And they thought, oh my God, I thought you were health and safety. I was like, no. So I haven't done that since. But for The Boy in the Box, actually, I had a garage a few years ago. I just sold it up. And I was mixing some chlorine and brake fluid to see how that would combust. That was some research that I did for The Boy in the Box.
I thought you were going to say you moved to Spain for the research. I was going to
No.
say that was commitment.
No, that's a bit extreme. No, so I had a few little explosions and some bad smoke, but yeah, some little bits and pieces over the years.
I like the commitment to the science of these things here. You two are getting points at the bottom for like conducting experiments.
I can't be trusted with chemicals. So.
I had actually a friend of mine goes up to the Somme in France quite a lot. Actually, the ex-police officer that helped me, and he collects World War II shrapnel or bullets. He says when you go up to France, he said the old farmers are, turning the earth over, and how to say it? I'm thinking about the bombs that haven't gone off. How to say that? They're all on the side of the road, and he said you can just pick them up. And he's picked up grenades from the Second World War. He's picked up old bullets. And in the garage, we actually took the top off and emptied some of the gunpowder out. And yeah.
No, I can't be trusted with stuff like that.
No, I just feel like it might be dangerous.
That's where the excitement is.
It's not hard to make gunpowder either.
And that's probably how you ended up with the false hand then, eh?
Yes, essentially. Before we go back on topic, I'm going to ask you all my favourite question, which is what have you read recently and really enjoyed?
Who are you asking?
Oh, yeah.
All of you. Who wants to go first?
I'm currently reading In the Pain of Strangers by Andy Barrett. That's rather good. He's a CSI, so again, you expect a lot of authenticity, and I really enjoy that. It's got a historical element to it. It's a set in a northern setting, so not anything I'd normally read, which is a bit different.
I keep harping on about a book, and I keep going back to it, and it's called The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. And it's a non-fiction book, and it's all about the tactics that serial killers like predators and people along those lines will actually use to gain your trust, and how to listen to your gut, that if something's wrong. And I always pick it up whenever I've kind of finished one read, and I'll kind of almost like use it to be a little bit of a palate refresher. I don't know. But I just think that it's one of those books that I think everybody should read, that it could save some lives.
Cool.
My suggestion's useless in this panel. It's been Colleen Hoover, I'm afraid.
That's all right. All valid.
It's just something like Dark Side.
Yeah, Ugly Love, I think it was called. But there you go.
I like Andy's books. They're set very in the area. Well, they're set exactly in the area where I live. The last one I read of his, they were chasing a killer in the exact sort of part of Leeds that I live in, and I was like, whoa, this is a bit close to home. But he's a good read.
It's when you put your house in it that you have to worry.
Pardon?
You put your house in it, then you have to worry.
Yes.
Would you not think you're in like a Twilight Zone episode if you started reading it and it was describing like the room that you're in and you and what you were dressed in?
That would be quite eerie, wouldn't it?
A great trick to pull on someone.
It would. I mean, my name is in one of them. I did find my name in one of his books. But that was not that's less spooky. That was okay. I don't mind that. So what have we covered? We've done all of your things. Have you got any particular sort of signatures or anything that your killers have in the book? So we discussed that they're maybe not very real. Well, you maybe don't go as elaborate in real life if you're a serial killer, but what have you got in your books that are kind of like the
I
serial
like
killers?
to write female serial killers. I find that more challenging. So most of my books, apart from the memoirs, obviously, are they have female killers in them.
Whereas there's a male killer in the memoir.
That would be telling. There are a few dead bodies.
That's why she had to move to Spain. So they didn't catch her.
Is there a reason why you chose just to do female killers, or?
I don't know really. I don't know. I just write, and I end up having these wacky, unhinged females that just go a bit nutty, and they take place from the end of the Second World War right up to modern day. So it just depends on, what I choose at that particular time, what I pick.
Well, my killer in The Brother, he's a bit of he's very much a predator. However, he likes a challenge. So his MO, as much as it is he will take something from a victim and put it on an eBay style site. And whoever wins the bid becomes the next victim. And then he takes something from them and so on and so forth to create this kind of chain. So on his sort of app that he uses, he can then, it's almost like his trophies. So he can see what he sold to each person. And that way, all his kills are like all over the place with all different people. He's not choosing them. They are choosing themselves in his eyes. And he kills them in all different ways, depending on what he feels like at the time.
And the eBay sales cover some of the mileage as well.
They do indeed. When he drops it off.
Well, for me, I tend to like serial killers who are doing something that's a bit different and a bit clever. I think that will be my signature, is trying to come up with a serial killer who is capable of matching wits with an incredibly clever police detective. And so it's sort of like that cat and mouse chase. So those who haven't read it, the Evolution of the Serial Killer is the idea that DCI Morton is basically in the doghouse at the Met, and he's assigned the job of training all of the new detectives. And he starts giving them all the normal exercises, and it's a bit boring. So he decides to spice things up and asks them all to plot the perfect murder and come back the next week, and he'll tell them how he would catch that killer. Unfortunately for him, among this year's crop of recruits is an aspiring serial killer who is going to take everything they learn in class and kill one person every week using the methods that their fellow detectives have described, fixed by Morton's advice to be almost uncatchable. And that creates the tension for the novel, is that every week there will be one new murder, and we know exactly how they're going to commit the murder because it's already been described by one of the student detectives as their idea of a perfect murder. And then Morton doesn't just have to outwit a serial killer, he has to outwit himself, because he's the one that's told them how he'd catch that serial killer, and they can then refine their methodology to circumvent how he'd catch him.
That sounds interesting.
That does sound interesting.
So I got asked an interesting question the other day that I'd like to pose if I can.
Yeah, go for it.
To everyone. So I was asked, in the serial killer Olympics, which serial killer would get the gold in your eyes? And I actually said, for me, it would be Ted Bundy, because he not only managed to represent himself in court, he escaped as well. And he managed to do everything that he did and charm people, and no one's ever suspected that he had that kind of dark side to him. So that's what I'd ask you guys, in real life, which real life serial killer would win the gold in the serial killer Olympics for you?
It's got to be the one we never heard about, the guy or gal that is out there on the streets killing multiple people that we don't know, that's never been caught, that's never been suspected, potentially never even arrested. And that's the person that will win the gold, because we never see them coming. They nick the gold medal and be out of the stadium before we know it.
I agree.
That's a good answer. Are you all into watching kind of true crime and like old sort of historicals? We know that Nikki is, because we were talking about it before we went live, weren't we? But you all kind of similarly into watching old like true crime documentaries and things like that?
I quite like the dramatizations. As we were discussing before, like Des was quite fantastic recreation. We've seen what was it, Colin Sutton's career has been dramatized. So there's been some really interesting contemporary docu-series. I don't know what you'd call it. It's sort of somewhat fictionalized, but not.
I watched The Watts Family. I thought that was interesting about the father that murdered his family. And interestingly enough, his picture and his wife and his 2 kids are used on greeting cards, which I found was really odd. It's been found that his pictures have been used on greeting cards. So hopefully they've pulled them.
What, like as a stock image?
Yeah, they've used that as like the perfect family with the father and the wife and the kids that he murders, a famous case. That image has been used as stock image. Well, presumably after, because they're dead, aren't they?
You know, I'm fascinated by, as we were talking about before we went live, Jack the Ripper. That was the case that got me into all of this mess. That kind of drew me in. When I was very little, I went to Madame Tussauds, and everyone was like, you know, you're not allowed down to the dungeons of horrors and all this. And of course, I was like,
the horror of chambers.
Yeah, the
chamber of horrors.
That's it. And off I went down there. And the very first diorama, when you press the button, it was Jack the Ripper kind of leaning over a disemboweled woman on the cobbled streets of London. And from then on, I was
I've used reference to Madame Tussauds a couple of times in my books, and Jack the Ripper as well.
Yeah,
because I find that through personal experience as well, that wax figures do very much look like real life dead bodies, which I find really. But I wonder if that's part of the allure, that because people are naturally fascinated by the macabre, aren't they? We drive past a car accident, everyone's there going, oh, because they're looking for that scene of blood or something unusual that's sort of fascinates the human psyche.
I mean, talking about sort of waxworks, on the podcast, we were talking about the anatomical Venuses. I don't know whether you guys know them. And they were from the Victorian era, and they were women, sort of models of women that had been made that would come apart. So medical students could see the internal organs, but it was very controversial because the women looked like they were enjoying being pulled apart. But they are incredibly creepy to have a look at, and a lot of them still exist in museums today.
Did you watch that? I forget what it's called. It was a German mortician with a hat. And he used to do a TV show where he would have a live model where he would explain what was going on. And then on his table, he'd actually have a real corpse.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember what his name was. It was...
It's Gunther von Hagens. So you can go see his art exhibition as well, where he's like displayed bodies and things.
Yeah, and I remember they was talking about a woman that had died of breast cancer, and they had this body that was completely frozen, and he just put a bandsaw straight through the middle of her breast and then turned it around and goes, this is what you can see. But it was really, really eerie. And I forget what his name was. It was, I think he's German, with this hat.
Gunther von Hagens. He looks like a serial killer.
Does he?
He does.
Maybe he is. Maybe those are the victims. They didn't sign anything.
People willingly donate their bodies to be turned into art by him, but he looks like, when you see him on the documentaries and you see the pictures of him, he does look like a kind of movie villain.
With the voice as well.
Yeah, it's got that vibe.
And yet I'm fixated and I just want to learn more. And it's like, he's just so creepy.
I think that's part of it. It draws you in as a character, and when they've got that little bit sinister side to them, it really does kind of draw you into them and what they're doing. Because I think it's hopefully a very rare quality in the kind of normal population to have that kind of sinister side.
Hopefully.
You would hope, wouldn't you? But yeah, I saw that documentary. I think his art exhibition, like I said, is great as well. worth going to see.
Where is it?
Provided I'm not freaked out about bodies. I think it travels around. But I've been to see it when it was in Manchester.
I'd love to go something like that.
Yeah, it was really good.
Might not go to
It was
Spain.
interesting. Pardon?
Might not go travelling to Spain.
He's not in Spain.
There might be a Spanish version though.
I'm sure there are many.
Yeah, I think it's quite worldwide, isn't it? There's like a lot of them. There's probably one in like London. You're probably best place to go see one, Sean.
I probably am. I should have a look, see what there is.
What are you all working on at the moment?
Well, I'm working on the book that's set in 91, which has proven quite hard to do, just due to the fact that, like I said, the technology wasn't the same, but I need to set it in that time period. So I'm kind of going back and forth, making sure that that's all okay. And I'm also working on a cozy crime at the moment as well.
What's that about?
The cozy's all about a professor of urban legends and creepypastas who gets murdered in a little village. And the little village is called Watcher on the Wold.
Nice. Sean, what are you working on?
So I've got 2 books I'm working on at the moment. One is called Damned by the Dead, which is my second D.I. Rafferty novel. In that one, a guy who was the armourer to gangs in London and was supplying them with guns for different crimes, gets Alzheimer's, dies, and his daughter inherits his house that's full of weapons that have been used in hundreds of historical crimes. She turns the whole lot over to the Met, and they start investigating all these historical crimes and start connecting them to modern day murders. And the gangsters involved are still alive, and they react as you would expect with violence. So that's one of mine. And then I'm also working on a standalone, which is called MI75. It's elderly victims who get solicited into working for what they think is a military intelligence unit run by the British government, playing on the fact that they used to serve in the forces, and asking them to do one last job to kill someone before they die. But unfortunately for them, it's not actually the military services at all. It's a criminal who's setting them up and using them to commit murder.
I'm working on 2 books. Hopefully at the end of the year, I'm going to release one. And for next year, I'm working on a thriller about 4 girls, 4 friends that decide they live in around London. They decide to go to Spain for an Airbnb. And slowly they end up getting bumped off. So I can't really say too much about that, but they end up dying, apart from one.
The final girl.
The final girl, while they're staying at an Airbnb in the middle of Spain in the rural countryside. And the one that I'm hoping to release at the end of the year, if I can get my act together, is a dark romance involving a stalker and an ex-con. So that would be interesting, a new genre for me. But
How do you all feel about playing with genre? Would you write in other genres? Sort of completely away from crime or dark things, or?
Well, I would love to write a fantasy, but I don't have the mind for it. I don't have the language difference or the imagination for anything involving vampires and dragons or anything like that. I just don't. Or werewolves. They seem to be a thing now for monster romance thing. I can't write that. But I have written across a couple of different genres that I enjoy. It's a nice palette cleanser, switching from one to the other.
I used to write youth adult, and I used to write youth adult supernatural stuff. So I did write vampires and zombies and werewolves and all sorts of things. And they definitely dipped into kind of thrillers and were quite dark for youth adult. And I used to write a lot of horror stories as well. But I am kind of I love thrillers. Thrillers are kind of my main thing. So anything that's kind of a little bit of an offshoot works for me really well. So the cozy's not too bad. And I am working on a speculative thriller as well.
I'd stick to the crime.
Yeah, but what do you write, Sean?
He writes romance. So you don't want to write a romance, Sean, then?
It's a love letter to a serial killer. That'll be the next one. I'll put it on the list. Actually, that's not
Interesting.
bad. I'd read that.
That's a good
There
title.
are a lot of women that actually fall in love with serial killers.
Yeah, there's enough for it to have a proper name, isn't there? Like Ophelia name.
Yeah. Love letter to a serial killer.
Has someone done that? Hang on.
You're gonna have to write that down now. You've got an idea.
He's writing it down. It's an idea there.
Oh, I've been beaten to it. It already exists.
Ah.
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Yours would be better, Sean. Just write it anyway.
Not original now. Oh, it only came out in June, so I'm only a few months too late. This
But
is
yeah,
a missable read.
we've only got a few minutes left now. So can you finish off our chat by reminding everyone what they're going to go away and buy of your books? So if they're watching it and they've enjoyed the conversations we've had, what should they go away and be purchasing?
So I've got my first book has been re-released. It's called Little Bones. The one that's out there at the moment. Oh, it matches me. The one that's out there at the moment has got a slightly different cover. It's got a more wintry cover on there. So that's available on ebook, audiobook, and paperback. And then the next one is The Brother, and that's also available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. And then my latest one is 13th Girl, which is also available in ebook and audiobook.
Go on, Sean.
Go on. Okay. So if you've not heard anything by me, start with the first one, Dead on Demand. It's pretty good. And if you get it directly from me, you can have a free bookmark. If you like the one I mentioned, it was The Evolution of a Serial Killer. They're all standalones, but they've got the same cast of returning characters.
If you've never read any of my books, you can start with The Kidnapper's Word, followed by book 2, The Boy in the Box. That's a police procedural set in 1969 in UK. And I have Amelie, which is about a girl that survives Auschwitz and then goes on to live life as an assassin. That's a standalone.
Sounds really fascinating. And then all that's left for me to say is thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So,
Having a pleasure.